Because of the ongoing and devastating war, the imperialistic forces have tried to tear our unified and strong society apart, completely and utterly annihilate us, and make sure that we can never lift our heads again and are forced to submit forever. However, the effect that they are expecting or hoping for will, unfortunately, never come to pass because the required conditions and circumstances simply do not exist. Because instead this war has come to bond us, unite us, and more than ever, we remain standing.
What would you do if your nation's soul was shackled by the hands that once claimed to civilize it? Would you bow, or would you burn the chains? On May 9th, beneath the unforgiving sky of Moscow's Red Square, one man gave his answer, not in speeches, but in silence. No suit, no tie. Only desert fatigues and a crimson scarf that cut through the cold like a warning flare. Ibrahim Traoré, the resolute leader of Burkina Faso, stood beside Vladimir Putin not as a subordinate but as a sovereign. He had expelled France. He had defied the world order. And in doing so, he lit a fire across a continent. If this moment stirs something in you, stay with us. The truth is just beginning. On Victory Day, the 80th anniversary of Nazi Germany's defeat, world leaders gathered in Moscow under the shadow of history. There were flags, generals, and finely pressed suits from across Eurasia. But amid that sea of symmetry, one figure fractured the pattern. He wore no Western uniform, no ceremonial medals, just a desert military jacket and a blood-red scarf defiant as flame. He stood not behind the crowd, but beside Vladimir Putin, shoulder to shoulder. This was not an accident of protocol. It was a symbol. Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old president of Burkina Faso, had arrived at the heart of Russia's power, not as a client, but as a challenger to the global order. And he made that message explicit. In an interview aired across Russian state media, he said, "What I regret most is that I spent my youth listening to foreign voices telling our story. That is the most dangerous form of colonization, of the mind." Those words rang like a gunshot through the corridors of Europe. A young African leader, once invisible to the Western gaze, now stood under the Kremlin spotlight and declared war, not on a nation, but on a system. And the world began to ask, who is this man who dared to humiliate France, who broke from the West, and walked straight into Moscow's waiting arms? What does he want? And more urgently, what does he threaten to become? It began not with a speech, but a single gunshot, on the morning of September 30th, 2022, while the world looked elsewhere. The capital city of Ouagadougou trembled. Tanks rumbled, flags fell, and power changed hands, not through negotiation, but through resolve. But this was no ordinary coup. The man behind it was not a decorated general or political heir. He was a captain, young, unknown, without media polish or foreign backing. His name was Ibrahim Traoré, and within hours, the interim president was gone. No bloodbath, no civil war. Only the eerie silence of a people watching something impossible take shape. Traoré did not seize power for ambition. He did it because the old system had collapsed, because promises had died, because his people were starving, and their gold was vanishing into Parisian vaults. Burkina Faso had been a ghost state, haunted by French bases, suffocated by IMF debts, governed by puppets. It was a nation where children held empty rice bowls, while foreign executives flew over their heads in private jets. But Traoré had no intention of playing caretaker to a dying order. In his first 90 days, he torched every diplomatic fiction. In February 2023, he ordered French troops to withdraw from Camp Camboinsin, the strategic nerve center of French military control in the Sahel. Within weeks, the tricolor flag was pulled down, soldiers packed. France was gone. In March, he tore apart every bilateral military agreement with Paris, declaring them relics of a colonial past. By May, Burkina Faso exited La Francophonie, the cultural cloak under which France masked its continued influence. The withdrawal was not symbolic. It was surgical. French telecom giant Orange was forced to surrender control of its infrastructure to domestic partners. Bolloré, the logistics empire, lost its monopoly on trade routes. Malt imports, once held under a French stranglehold, were broken up and redistributed under community ownership. But it was more than contracts. Traoré was severing psychological chains. In a nation long groomed to speak French, think French, and obey in French, he turned the narrative inward. He said, colonialism no longer wears uniforms. It wears scholarships, loans, and treaties designed to fail. And the people listened. They did more than listen. They believed. He was not just dismantling military bases. He was dismantling inferiority. For decades, Burkina Faso's currency, the West African CFA franc, had been printed in Paris and regulated by French-controlled banks. Its reserves, billions in national wealth, sat locked in French treasuries. Its development was designed to depend. But Traore declared, no more. He established Burkina Faso's first sovereign gold reserve, 300 kilograms of bullion extracted from its own soil, stored within its own borders. Not a gram to be pledged, not a coin to be exported. Foreign mining companies, long untouchable, were ordered to surrender 15% equity to the state, localize 90% of their workforce, and transfer extraction technology. And when they hesitated, he revoked their licenses. No court, no warning, just a presidential decree. Then came the infrastructure revolution. In just 1 year, over 20,000 kilometers of rural roads paved, national cement, tomato, and gold refineries opened, an electric vehicle factory launched, designed and built by Burkinabe engineers. But the heart of Traore's uprising was not steel or gold. It was education. He reopened 250 schools in conflict zones, built 44 new high schools, founded 10 public universities. Tuition was abolished from primary through university. Textbooks were rewritten in native languages. And across crumbling village walls, new slogans were painted in red. Freedom does not serve the obedient. Still, the West remained silent, watching, calculating. But Traore was not waiting for applause. He refused his presidential salary, took home the wage of a captain, cut state travel expenses by 7%, ordered all public spending to be published online. In 1 year, budget losses dropped from 18% to 6%, and the people saw it. By the end of 2024, Burkina Faso, once ranked 184th on the UN's Human Development Index, had risen to 102nd, GDP up 4%, poverty down to 24.9%, public approval 87%. The West did not cheer, because Traore's revolution was not just national, it was contagious. In Mali and Niger, governments began to fall. French soldiers were expelled. Alliances formed. A new axis of resistance was being born, not in Geneva, not in Paris, but in the dust and courage of the Sahel. And still, one question echoed through embassies and editorial rooms. Who is this captain who dares to break the script? What happens when you banish an empire but create a vacuum? In early 2023, as French soldiers rolled out of Ouagadougou and Western envoys packed their briefcases, something else began to descend from the skies. Unmarked aircraft, no flags, no announcements. By the time the world noticed, it was too late. Russia had arrived, but not with parades or press conferences, with strategy. At least 100 Russian military advisors, linked to the Africa Corps, Moscow's successor to the infamous Wagner Group, landed in Burkina Faso. Their mission, not to dominate but to stabilize, to train, equip, and embed with Burkinabe troops on the front lines of insurgent conflict. In the dusty strongholds of the Sahel, Djibo Somme, the northern borderlands, they did not deliver lectures, they fought. And Traore welcomed them, not with dependency but with conditions. This was not a surrender to a new master. It was a calculated alliance. He said, "We do not trade one leash for another. We build our own ground and let others stand with us, not above us." Western capitals panicked. Analysts called it a pivot to authoritarianism. French tabloids accused him of selling Africa to Moscow. But Traore was unmoved, because behind the scenes, the stakes were higher than headlines. Burkina Faso had no domestic defense industry. For decades, it relied on Western donations, second-hand arms, and spare promises. But by late 2023, the first cargo from Russia arrived. Armored vehicles, drone systems, desert radar, and tactical comms, anti-insurgency equipment, designed for asymmetric warfare, total value $75 million. For the first time, Burkina Faso could defend itself without dialing Paris. But Moscow's cargo did not stop at weapons. They brought infrastructure, engineers, metallurgists. Russia's North Gold was granted access to 2 key mining sites, Taparko and Yaga, once under French influence. But Traore issued hard rules. No raw exports, no Western intermediaries. On-site refining, only a minimum share of national reserve gold allocated to state vaults. This was not a resource giveaway. It was a reverse extraction of knowledge, of leverage, of autonomy. Traore called it monetary independence 1.0. Western banks warned of sanctions. The IMF threatened to freeze loans. The World Bank withheld $120 million in aid, citing governance concerns. Traore replied simply, freedom is expensive. But so is obedience. In January 2024, Russia went further. They erased Burkina Faso's Soviet-era debt, over $1.5 billion. They signed cooperative frameworks on logistics, metallurgy, and rail systems. They pledged to help map and secure mineral corridors outside Western control. And when Traore was invited to the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, he did not sit in the back row. He sat beside Vladimir Putin, Belarus's Lukashenko, and Central Asia's rising strongmen. He spoke not of poverty or aid, but of sovereignty and parity. We are not a zone of influence. We are a partner. Respect that or move aside. His words were broadcast across Africa. And something extraordinary happened. In Mali, youth painted over French graffiti with Traore's name. In Niger, protests turned into referendums for independence. In Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, questions whispered in coffee shops and campuses, why not us? Why not now? This was no longer about Burkina Faso. It was about the fracture of a system. For over 60 years, post-colonial Africa had been trapped in a gilded cage, allowed to elect but not choose, to develop but not decide. But now, a young captain with no pedigree, no inheritance, no permission, was shattering that architecture in broad daylight. Of course, not everyone celebrated. European governments began revoking visas for Burkina officials. NGOs withdrew from critical areas, citing safety. Food aid dwindled in the north, where over 2 million relied on foreign rations. The message was clear: without us, you starve. But Traore did not flinch. He shifted emergency supply deals to Turkey and Iran, accelerated local agricultural reforms, ordered military escorts for relief convoys. And when asked if he feared isolation, he smiled. We are not isolated. We are choosing our own weather. Still, beneath the roaring speeches and crimson scarves, a question gnawed at allies and enemies alike: was Traore a liberator or a tactician? Was his alliance with Russia a vision or a gamble? Would Burkina Faso rise as the blueprint for a post-colonial Africa, or fall as a cautionary tale of miscalculated resistance? One thing was certain. The ground beneath Africa's feet was shifting, and the West, for the first time in decades, was not in control of the tremors. Freedom, as it turns out, does not come wrapped in applause. It comes cloaked in fire. By mid-2024, the global pushback had begun. Sanctions were whispered, then formalized. Development loans evaporated. Western contractors fled mid-project, leaving hospitals unfinished and roads half-laid. International donors halted vaccine shipments. Humanitarian agencies declared hostile conditions and pulled out. Burkina Faso, now seen as radioactive in diplomatic circles, was being slowly choked, and yet its people stood taller. In the markets of Ouagadougou, fruit sellers played speeches of Traore over their radios. Children painted murals of Thomas Sankara alongside their president's silhouette. School walls were draped in new banners. We would rather hunger for a year than kneel for a lifetime. But hunger did come. In the north, food convoys stalled. Prices tripled. Hospitals rationed supplies. Malaria surged. The very people Traore had risen to defend, villagers, teachers, street vendors, now bore the brunt of geopolitical punishment. His critics emerged from the shadows. Was it worth it? Was independence a flag too heavy to carry? In private, even his ministers questioned the pace. But Traore refused to bend. He slashed government salaries, starting with his own. He froze parliament's foreign travel. He dissolved 3 ministries to reallocate funds to rural medical units. And when foreign donors abandoned the national vaccine program, he launched one with Turkish and Iranian support. Limited, imperfect, but his. Still, the pressure was relentless. France began broadcasting anti-government content into Burkina airwaves. Western think tanks called for urgent democratic normalization. Journalists framed Traore as a militarized populist and a pawn of Russian ambition. The language was coded, but the threat was clear. They would break him with stories, if not with sanctions. But for Traore, the battlefield was not Twitter. It was memory. He remembered what it meant to be forgotten. Born in a mud-walled village raised on millet and silence, he had watched as friends were conscripted into mines, as women buried children without names, as men vanished into the mouth of foreign-owned machinery. Now, when he looked into the eyes of the people, he saw that memory mirrored back. This was not about geopolitics, it was about dignity. In 2024, Burkina Faso launched its first State of the Nation address in 3 native languages, Maore, Fulani, and Dioula. French was not banned. It was simply omitted. A new generation was being taught that colonization did not end with flags. It continued in contracts, in curriculums, in currencies. That realization ignited something elemental. In a town called Kaya, villagers built a monument of broken French radios, stacked like bones, topped with a single phrase etched in iron. We speak for ourselves now. But while hearts were hardening, so too were consequences. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso announced a mutual defense pact, the Alliance of Sahel Sovereignty. To its founders, it was a shield. To the West, it was an insurgency. The U.S. State Department warned of regional destabilization. The French president, in a rare unscripted outburst, said, "These regimes will either fall or collapse their nations trying." And then came the financial dagger. A consortium of European and American banks froze over $500 million in trade reserves and development accounts. SCUFT access was restricted. Importers were left stranded. Fuel ran short. Electricity flickered. ATM lines wrapped around buildings for blocks. It was the 21st century version of a siege. But instead of surrendering, Traore doubled down. He announced a national energy transition plan, fast-tracked through Turkish solar partnerships and Iranian fuel supply chains. He reopened mothballed copper and bauxite sites under state ownership, and he ordered the minting of Burkina Faso's first pilot digital currency. Untethered from the CFA franc, he was not improvising, he was planning. But even revolutionaries bleed. That summer, Traore's convoy was ambushed near the town of Dori. Rocket-propelled grenades tore into the lead vehicles. 3 of his guards died. The president survived, but just barely. Western media called it an accident. Burkina Whispers called it something else. At the funeral, Traore spoke only once. "I was born where maps do not bother to label. I will die for it if I must. But this time we will write our own borders, in ink, not chains." And still, the rumors grew, that inside the presidential palace, not all were loyal. That not every general favored Russia. That in the heat of Traore's gamble, someone, somewhere, was preparing to fold. Every revolution invites a knife from within. In October 2024, just as the Alliance of Sahel Sovereignty announced joint military drills near the Niger-Burkina border, a classified memo leaked. 6 pages, marked top secret, eyes only. It detailed an internal security breach at the Ministry of Defense. Encrypted communications between a senior Burkina general and a French attaché in Dakar. Coded phrases. Financial transfers traced through Swiss banks. Meetings held at night, outside embassy walls. And then, one unmistakable line, "The president has made too many enemies. It is time for continuity through necessary change." The name was redacted, but Traore already knew. General Yakuba Sanogo, decorated veteran. Western trained, long silent but always in the room. He had once shared Traore's war room. Now he shared Paris's war plan. 3 weeks later, a scheduled fuel shipment to the northeast was ambushed. Not by terrorists, but by elite soldiers of the 3rd Armored Battalion, loyal to Sanogo. The tankers were torched. 7 civilians died. Burkina's army, always the spine of Traore's revolution, was cracking. And worse, the world had begun hedging. The IMF, which had frozen $120 million in aid months earlier, suddenly offered a new line of emergency credit. On one condition: restructuring of executive authority. France restored consular functions in Abidjan, openly hosting exiled opposition figures. Germany offered to mediate dialogue. Even ECOWAS, the West African bloc long seen as France's proxy, issued a vague yet ominous statement. "We encourage constitutional stabilization in Burkina Faso." It was diplomatic code for regime change. And then, one final blow, Russia hesitated. After months of arms and engineers, of promises and parades, Moscow's new military delegation missed a scheduled bilateral review in Ouagadougou. No explanation. No apology. Traore's calls went unanswered for days. Finally, a brief message from the Russian Foreign Ministry. Burkina Faso is encouraged to consider internal balance as it continues its journey of sovereignty. Translated, even Moscow had begun to blink. Isolation, Once a choice was becoming a reality. But Traore, wounded, cornered, did not flinch. He summoned his remaining loyal generals, laid the leaked memo on the war table, and spoke without raising his voice. They thought we were a moment, but we are a movement. If I fall, bury me not with flags, but with firewood. So the next one knows where to stand. He then ordered the immediate arrest of General Sanogo and 8 co-conspirators. At 2:47 a.m., the military police raided a villa on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Inside they found weapons, cache satellite phones, one laptop containing a file titled Post-Traore Framework. In it, a provisional constitution reinstating French military agreements, a proposal to reintroduce the CFA franc, a cabinet list, with Sanogo as transitional president, and a scheduled press briefing. Planned in Paris, the betrayal was absolute. The return to submission was already mapped, but it never reached a microphone. By dawn, Traore stood before the nation. No uniform, just a simple white tunic and the scarf he had worn in Moscow. I will not surrender your future to those who were born to trade it, and I will not die while cowards write our story in exile. The capital roared. In the streets, thousands gathered. In the villages, bonfires were lit. In the air, drums of resistance began to beat again. The revolution had nearly been buried, but now it had teeth. The dust had not settled. The streets of Ouagadougou still carried the scent of smoke and sweat. The air was thick, not with fear, but with conviction. From the northern deserts to the southern fields, people emerged, not in riot, in renewal. They painted over colonial murals with scenes of Burkina engineers building wind turbines. They renamed boulevards after languages once silenced. They erected statues, not of warriors, but of farmers, teachers, and daughters who dared to stay. Traore did not return to the palace. He walked into a classroom in Kaya, where desks had no legs and walls were held up by memory, and sat among the children. He whispered, "Do not learn to obey, learn to think." And in that silence, something louder than gunfire began to echo across Africa. In Mali, flags of sovereignty. So now we ask you, do you believe sovereignty is something granted or something remembered? Does dignity wait for permission or awaken through choice? If this story stirred something quiet but unshakable within you, let it rise. Leave your thoughts in the comments, not as opinions, but as testaments. Let others know that this moment matters, that Traore's stand was not a gesture but a signal. And if you believe, as we do, that history is not carved by the powerful, but remembered by the awake, then stay with us, not to follow, but to walk together. To those who still dream of a continent unbroken, a people unbent, and a truth untamed, welcome.